First of all, thank you all for coming. This is a huge audience, and I'm very, very grateful that so many of you were able to show up to hear me talk about the research I've been carrying out for the past year and a half or so. I've really, really enjoyed doing this. It's become a huge passion of mine, so I'm excited to share it with everybody. So what I focused on for this research was Heemparks in general, but specifically on their management and how it relates to vegetation richness. So a brief background on myself, especially for international guests. I'm from a suburb of New York City called Fanwood, New Jersey. I went to school in Syracuse, New York. I've been pursuing becoming a landscape architect since the start of high school, only about 13 or 14. I got interested in this stuff really, really early and was fortunate to learn about it so early. I gained a passion for native plants and ecological design, and that led me to go to school at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. I graduated with my Bachelor of Landscape Architecture in 2020, and now I'm currently a candidate for the degree of Master of Science concentrated in Landscape and Urban Ecology. So from New Jersey, went to school in New York. How did I end up pursuing a thesis topic in the Netherlands? One of the reasons I decided to go to ESF, they have a fantastic program that allows you to go off campus during your 5th year. And myself and a bunch of my classmates decided to live in Rotterdam for 3 months. And while I was there, I discovered the Amstelveen Heemparks, which, as somebody fascinated by native plants and native ecosystems, was a dream for me. So during those 3 months, I commuted to Amstelveen multiple days a week and was able to work directly with the gardeners there and learn how naturalistic landscapes are designed, how they're managed, and I wrote a self-published book on translating those lessons to other parts of the world. So this became a huge passion of mine and something I wanted to continue studying as a master's student. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but just wanted to run through some quick definitions. What is a naturalistic landscape? I specifically use naturalistic as opposed to natural because they are design systems. The easiest way to understand that in context is to compare it to some other landscape typologies. So I'm going to do a brief history of all of landscape design in about 4 slides. I bulked them into 3 major categories to explain the transition of thinking over time. It starts with nature tamed, which is the earliest human manipulation of the landscapes. That's going back to earliest farming, cutting down trees for settlement, landforming in the Netherlands that started thousands of years ago that first allowed for human habitation. And essentially, life was dangerous and difficult, and the reality was that those were successful in taming and conquering nature were the ones that survived. But as you move forward, people started to create landscapes for human use and interest. These were very rigid, linear gardens that were perfecting nature. These Renaissance gardens, Baroque gardens, and similar ones throughout history. And during that period, they were really perceived as assisting nature. Elements like clipped hedges, parterres, and axial symmetry were nature perfected in their views. They seem a bit more highly artificial and non-diverse now. And a big major change came about in the early 18th century when the English landscape garden was pioneered. And this started after all, centuries, thousands of years of designing landscapes for specifically human use, very rigid and perfect. This was the first attempt to more or less imitate nature. And in the beginning, that was mostly just utilizing curves instead of straight lines. It felt more natural, like a pastoral scene. and Capability Brown, Frederick Law Olmsted were some of the pioneers in this. Nature Tamed and Nature Perfected are still ongoing at this point, but you start to see more landscapes that feel like wild spaces. But those were only mimicking nature visually. It wasn't until about 150 years ago that people started to try and design spaces that mimic natural function as well, which was a big step. So that only happened about 150 years ago, started with figures such as William Robinson, Gertrude Jekyll, and it only really began to get wider recognition in the past 50 years or so with the beginning of the modern environmental movement. So this is a really fairly new, still developing way of designing, way of thinking naturalistic gardens. And Heemparks, which is going to be the topic that I'm covering, were among the earliest examples of this way of thinking, not simply looking natural, but utilizing native plants in combinations that would be seen in the wild. They were developed in the early 1900s. Some of the pioneering figures were Dr. Jacobus Teisse, Eli Hymans, and some of their other contemporaries. And these parks are pretty unknown from what I've found. The nice thing about writing a thesis about an unknown topic is that I'm contributing a lot to the body of knowledge, but there's also not a lot written on this. So a lot of what I'm going to cover is essentially new information that hasn't been widely published yet. And now, as more and more people are recognizing that the ongoing environmental crisis is a design crisis, and every design decision is an environmental decision, successful examples of how you can design spaces that are ecologically functional are very important, and Heemparks provide this. So what are Heemparks? They are really one of the earliest extant examples of naturalistic designed landscapes, over almost 100 years of history at this point, but still vastly understudied. And the etymology of the word can tell you a lot about what it is. So it's derived from the Dutch term heemkunde, which is the study of local history and geography. Inheem translates to native, which describes the endemic species that are used in the parks. But it also refers to an atmosphere of home. And these are landscapes that feel as they should be in the space that they are. They feel natural. And one of the early designers of Heemparks, Chris Brusa, I believe it's pronounced, sorry, he is quoted saying, "People should feel as if they're surrounded by distinct aspects of their living environment, by the soil and climate they know and trust. Then they will feel at home surrounded by the vegetation, birds, and butterflies of their own countryside." So they're trying to make naturalistic spaces with native plants as they would function in a natural environment. And a common, not a direct translation, but a way of interpreting what Heemparks are. They're frequently referred to as habitat parks. And they are naturalistic designed landscapes specifically aimed at benefiting wildlife. So Heempark is a broader term that I'm going to use to describe several other landscape types. So you also have, in addition to Heemparks, there are Heem gardens, nature parks, nature gardens, and several other named landscapes that don't utilize any of these terms, but are still under the broader title of Heemparks. So if one is particularly called a Heem garden, Heemtown in Dutch, I would refer to it as that, but they're all broadly under the category of Heempark. So these spaces, they aim to be places where people can interact with nature and learn about local plants and habitats. One of the main reasons that they were first developed was for nature education. And they were designed to reflect local Dutch ecosystems, which is particularly important given how much human influence has shaped the Netherlands. There's no primary wilderness left in the country. There's wild spaces, but not primary undisturbed nature anymore. So when Tysa and his contemporaries were developing Heemparks, they recognized that this nature was disappearing, and this was a means to protect rare species and ecosystems. Frequently, they include multiple habitat types, so you'll walk through these parks and be constantly moving through woods and meadows and wetlands and everything in between. And one of the primary goals of the spaces is to have high species richness, which will be the main focus of the study. So when I first engaged with the Amstelveen Heemparks, I found parks that had 10 full-time gardeners, which if everybody worked 40 hours a week is 400 hours worked per week. They have a €500,000 annual budget, which allows them to take on extremely intensive management strategies down to removing single blades of grass with a weeding knife. I got to engage in that personally and know how detailed they are. And that allows them to have 400 or more unique native species growing in their parks. And the question is, how does the funding, workforces, and management strategies of other parks compare to this? This feels like a quite significant expenditure for a park like this. How do others compare? And similarly, how does the species richness of other parks compare? And that led me to the research question for this study, which is, how does management intensity affect herbaceous species richness in Heemparks? So to give you some context, Amstelveen is a suburb of Amsterdam, directly south of it. And in blue, that's roughly where the Amstelveen Heemparks are. They are one of about 140 Heemparks. So many people are only aware of the parks in Amstelveen. There are a lot more, and I was excited to see how other parks manage their space. So I couldn't study all 140, of course. So the first thing I had to do was select my sites for this study. And I went through a couple criteria. The first had to be accessibility. The other ones is a pretty small country, but still going all the way from Amstelveen to Groningen in a day and back, it wasn't feasible, cost and time-wise. So I determined a rough radius of 100 kilometers that would allow me to successfully get to any sites within this boundary and back in a day, and have enough time to carry out data collection in the field. And this was something that I found in the literature review, that multiple studies said that you need to balance sampling effort and the cost and time and resources. So that first step eliminated quite a few parks, and of the original 140, I had 95 left to choose from. Then I further narrowed them down by park size. Anything less than 1 hectare and more than 5 hectares, I chose not to look into further. I wanted the parks to be large enough to contain multiple different ecotypes within the boundaries, but also small enough to be manageably studied using the available time and resources, which narrowed it further down to about 48 of the original 140. And then I went through and looked into the existing literature. A lot of the parks that are recognized as theme parks don't have much information, or really any information published online. SNTP.nl was a website that I utilized very, very heavily. I would not have known about the vast majority of these parks' existence without it. It's an extremely valuable resource. But a lot of the parks listed on this website that's the only place you can find any information on them. So for the sake of my study, not having additional information was very difficult to overcome. So I specifically sought parks that had web presences, whether that was a single web page as part of a bigger government website or another parks website, preferably a dedicated website where they were publishing reports and documenting information that I could review and understand the design and management of the parks better, which further narrowed it down to about 35 parks, 21 of which had dedicated websites, which were the ones that I prioritized. And then I did a preliminary analysis of the management intensity. Since this was designed to be a comparative study, I wanted to avoid choosing sites with similar management intensities. I didn't want to have one park that was described as low management intensity and 7 that were high. For the sake of comparison, that would be less valuable. So that helped me begin to narrow down which parks I wanted to choose. And then the final selections that I made, I reached out to a bunch of parks and 10 replied and were excited and interested in engaging with me and were willing to take me on site visits and tell me all about their management. And we went forward with these 10. So they were Heemtown de Matten, which is located in the city of Apeldoorn. It aims to show the rich and varied flora of the Veluwe moraine and the IJssel Valley, which they noted was significantly disturbed and mostly lost due to construction of highways and new houses starting in the 1970s. So this is a rare little piece of protected wilderness. Naturetown de Robert, which is located in the city of Helmond. It's located in a larger nature reserve, and similarly, a lot of the area was disturbed by major residential development, agriculture. Heemtown Gouda's Halt is in the city of Gouda, and it aims to introduce visitors to characteristic landscapes of the regional peat meadows. The region is heavily used for farming, which has eliminated a lot of the local ecosystems. So this is, again, a very rare area of native plants that doesn't exist in the region very much anymore. Heempark Sertogenbosch aims to show an overview of the plants and vegetative communities typical of the Brabant region. Naturetown Zoetermeer aims to provide an overview of ecological and cultural landscapes characteristic of Zoetermeer and the broader region. Heempark Leiden aims to be a biodiverse and educational collection of Dutch landscapes, specifically showing South Holland landscapes as well as some from the rest of the country. Heemtown Rochven aims to showcase natural and cultural landscapes typical of the Brabant region as well, specifically the heather meadows on local sandy soil. Thesis, which is the first recognized theme park. It was actually a birthday present to Jacobi Thijssen, who was one of the original developers of the Heempark typology, nearly 100 years ago in 1925. It aims to preserve the diverse communities on the local calcareous dunes typical of coastal North Holland. De Heimenshof, named after Eli Heimans, another one of Thijssen's contemporaries who helped pioneer the development of theme parks, and it aims to show a diversity of species from the Haarlemmermeer region and the Greater Netherlands. And then Jacobi Thijssen Park, which is where I started and had to be part of this study as well, which is they aim to be a diverse ornamental arrangement of native Dutch plants naturally suited to be growing on the local peat soil. So there were a couple things that I had to focus on. This was going to be a comparative study between species richness and management intensity to see if there was overlap between the two. So I looked at the overall park species richness, which is the total number of unique species growing in each park. I did my own data collection of plot species richness, which is the number of unique species growing in a 1 by 1 meter plot. And I also collected data on invasive species presence and absence. There were a couple notable native competitive species that a lot of the parks mentioned that they had issue with. So I chose to make particular note of where I found those and where I didn't. And then for the management, I looked into the intensity practiced by each park. I'll discuss that and how I determined what the intensity of each park was in a little bit. And they'll range from low, moderate, high, and very high. I looked into the specific techniques practiced by each park and the goals, rationale, and explanations of these techniques. So this is a mixed method study. I use quantitative and qualitative data to gain a comprehensive understanding of the park's richness and management. And the quantitative field data that I collected specifically focused on species richness. So each park was broken down into a grid of 15 meter square plots. In the field, I measured these out with a rolling ruler as accurately as possible. There's a lot of natural barriers in the way, water and plants that I had to go through, but in general, I was able to measure it pretty accurately. In the field, I determined the vegetation cover types to better show what vegetation type I was measuring in. You were constantly moving between woods, meadow, wetland, and edges in between multiple different landscape types. So I did a basic determination in the field of what each of these plots were, whether they were woods, edge, meadow, or wetland. And within each of these larger 15 square meter plots, I marked one square meter subplot. I used representative sampling rather than random sampling to adequately represent the plot and avoid taking any samples that were disproportionately low or high. So a quick visual assessment of the area, and I measured one plot out that seemed to be generally representative of the space as a whole. And I counted all the individual unique species. I didn't identify them simply because these parks have hundreds of species growing in them. And while I'm quite comfortable IDing northeastern United States plants, I simply don't have the knowledge to accurately ID that many native Dutch plants. So the goal was simply to determine how many unique species can I identify rather than worrying about what specific species they were. And additionally, I recorded data on the presence and absence of invasive species, which were noted by several of the parks. The ones I chose to specifically look at were nettles, ivy, brambles, and grasses, brambles being usually blackberry, but anything in that rubus family. And I also made note of where there was bare soil, as Heemparks traditionally want to cover essentially every inch of their park that's not paths with plants. And then additional notes like light levels, notable vegetation, water bodies, and any other noteworthy features that I saw were marked down. And then there was qualitative data collection. I did a review of management plans, annual reports, any documentation I could get my hands on that explained management techniques, detailed financial information, species observations, anything that was available, I translated and read and documented in my thesis. But perhaps the most valuable piece of data collection came from site visits. I could review 100 documents and only be able to understand the techniques and the rationale as I interpreted them, but to go out into the field and discuss the techniques with the people who are actually carrying them out, put everything into perspective. I was able to understand how and why they did it very directly. I went in and did semi-structured interviews. I came in with questions that I wanted to have answered, but these were conversations. It allowed things to naturally come up. And as a result, I was constantly adjusting the questions I was asking, returning to parks after meeting with other gardeners, and constantly adding on to the information that I was receiving as I moved forward with the study. And all of these are simultaneously going on because I could communicate through email. So any questions I had, I can continue to ask and gain information over time. So the data collection really never stopped. Even when I came back to the United States, I was still reaching out and asking questions, getting clarifications to get as broad of a data set as I could. So brief overview, one of the things I looked at to determine the intensity levels of all the parks were funding, time, and the workforce. And you can clearly see through the chart that each generally increases from top to bottom. You go from parks that only have a couple hours worked each week, maybe a couple €1,000 spent on them, up to hundreds of hours a week, hundreds of thousands of euros spent on them. So immediately there's a broad range in the resources, funding, time, everything between these parks. And that's exactly what I wanted to figure out. There's this range. How does it impact? Does it impact species diversity as well? And I also did an overview of management techniques here briefly. From reviewing all of the annual reports, all of the management reports, these are several of the techniques that stood out from all of the parks. And I can break them down more into interventions that I saw to be practiced by all parks, regardless of intensity levels. First being all non-native species are removed. They're Heemparks. The defining factor is that they utilize native species. So no matter what level, if gardeners find non-native species, they remove them. The accessibility of parks is always maintained. You need to be able to safely move through the parks, and every single one of them make sure of that. This is an interesting one. All 10 parks I found to prune or cut their trees to increase light to the understory as a passive way of allowing a higher species richness. More light means more species have the opportunity to grow in every single park. Recognize that and utilize this technique. The meadows are mown at least once per year to manage succession, so meadows don't turn into woodlands. Each do this slightly differently. Some mow once a year, some mow twice a year, some have different interventions in different areas of the park. I detail that in my thesis. And then this is also interesting. The cuttings are removed to maintain poor soil quality, which is really different than conventional landscape management and what a lot of people are used to. The native soils are almost exclusively nutrient poor. Native plants are adapted to these conditions, so poor soil facilitates better growth of native species, while richer soil would allow more weeds to grow and necessitate more management. So they want to keep the soil as poor as possible. And there were also several interventions that increase as management intensity increases. The first was management of competition through weeding. That was something that the parks that I'm about to explain as low management did not practice. They do not manage competition. Every native species has a place in their park. But as you move up more intensively managed parks, increasingly spend more time and effort managing competition. Similarly, seeding and planting increases as management intensity increases. That's something that low managed parks typically don't do. They let plants compete and seed and grow and spread and do whatever they would naturally do, spontaneously come up throughout the park, while parks with higher management intensity are more likely to directly seed species that they want, ensure that anything that has been outcompeted can be reintroduced to the park. And then ornamental interventions also. Lower management parks typically don't spend too much time or any time at all on anything that would be considered strictly ornamental, strictly for beauty. But as you move up, parks with higher management intensity spend more time and are able to put time towards interventions to make the park beautiful. So here are the different management intensity levels. The first is low intensity management. I determined Heemtown de Matten, Naturetown de Robert, and Heemtown Goudeshout to be low intensity management. They averaged about 1,700 euros annually, 13 hours a week on average. They only use volunteers, and they were still able to support, on average, 166 unique species. The management techniques, they always ensured accessibility, competition wasn't managed, and no dedicated ornamental interventions. Moderate intensity management parks were Heemparks Sertogenbosch, Naturetown Zoetermeer, and Heempark Leiden. You can see the budget increased to 16,000. Again, an increase in hours worked. They're mostly volunteers. One had a dedicated employee, and the overall richness increased to about 217 species on average. Competition begins to be managed. Can't get to the entire park, but they're starting to focus on that, and some ornamental interventions, but that's not a priority. And then high intensity management parks, that's Heemtown Rukven, Theiseshof, and Heimanshof. Again, you see the budget shoot up to about $68,000 euros on average. Higher hours worked weekly, up to about 87 on average. All have one employee and multiple volunteers, and the average number of species shoots up again to about 443 on average. You start to see a pattern of all of these factors increasing. They start to manage competition even more in depth. The grasses still seem to pose an issue throughout a lot of the parks, and there's more ornamental interventions. And then the one very high intensity management park is Thesis Park, which has by far the highest budget, by far the most hours worked, multiple full-time employees, and 425 odd unique species. Here, all the competition is managed. They don't allow grasses in the park. Everything is taken out before it becomes a problem, and they have heavy focus of ornamental aspects. So now I'm going to go through some comparisons to show where there are correlations, where there aren't. And as you can see, these are all arranged in order of low to very high. And you can see a pretty clear, consistent increase with the total annual budget. As management intensity increases, budget increases. As management intensity increases, hours worked increases. Compare the two, they're pretty consistent. There's one flip-flop between Leiden that has a higher annual budget and lower hours worked because they don't utilize volunteers, so fewer people are helping out in the park. And similarly, you see a consistent increase of total herbaceous species inventory, 150 on average in low, 217 in moderate, up to 443 in high, and comparably a little bit lower, but still over 400 in Thesis Park. If you average them all, you see the similar constant increase based on management intensity. Plot richness, on the other hand, doesn't show a clear correlation. Every park has at least one data point that's above average, and only 2 parks are wholly above average. So it's going back and forth. The low management parks have some that are above, high management parks have some that are above. And you can see, compared to the other correlations, there's only a very actually minor negative correlation in plot diversity. You see them bouncing around and not really correlating with everything. And similarly, you can see based on management intensity, it's actually a slight negative trend. And this is better visualized with total herbaceous species in each of the parks compared to the plot diversity. So you'll see De Robert has 170 species total and about 5.1 species on average in any given 1 square meter. And the Hymanshof has 500 species growing in their park, but the same 5.1 species plot diversity. And then in Gouda, they have the highest plot diversity and the lowest total species richness. So plot diversity does not quite correlate the same way that total species richness does. And part of the reason that I figured for that was these are still design landscapes. There's ornamental and management decisions that gardeners choose to have areas of lower diversity and areas of higher diversity. So even in a park like Tysa Park that is very high intensity management, they still have areas that are low richness for both ornamental considerations and to make management in these areas easier so they can focus more on spaces that require more management. Invasive species presence and absence shows a bit more consistency. Red is below average, so these are parks that have fewer invasives recognized than the average, and the ones that are higher. So all parks have some values that are above average, some that are below average, but the clearest consistency here is the all other notes, which essentially shows here are all the plots that didn't have any invasive species in them. And you see all of the low managed and moderate managed parks have below average, so they have more invasives than the average. And the parks with high management intensity typically have way fewer invasive species than the average, specifically Tysa Park, which has eliminated almost 85% of invasives from all of their park. And you can see that in all of the observations. Brambles is a constant decrease, nettles, constant decrease, bare soil, constant decrease. The only one that isn't is ivy. And there are a couple of reasons that I found for this. The reality is some parks simply don't have issues with certain invasive species. So the low managed parks didn't remove the ivy. It just simply wasn't an issue to begin with for a lot of them. And the reason that the observations of ivy is so high in higher management parks is specifically in Thesis, which recently increased their management intensity. And in the past couple of years, they've really spent a lot of time and effort on removing ivy and replanting a diverse array of native herbaceous species, but it hasn't caught up with it yet. There's still a lot of ivy in the park. Redo this study in 5 years, the numbers are going to be completely different. I'm sure their richness is going to be higher and the presence of ivy is going to be lower. And then this is the very clear one. This is plots that don't have any invasives in them, and you see a clear constant increase. The low parks have the most invasives, the high management parks have the fewest. And that's because hours worked. You see herbaceous species increase at the same rate. You see hours worked and plots with no invasives observed increase. And you see average herbaceous species inventoried versus plots with no invasives observed both increase. They're all increasing in tandem. So this leads me to a couple conclusions. And I'm going to break them down into a couple different subcategories. The first is answering the original question, the effects of management intensity on herbaceous species richness in Heemparks. And you see higher levels of management intensity does not correlate with an increase in plot richness, which was in an individual, any given 1 square meter, because there are a lot of other factors at play here, ornamental considerations and whatnot. But parks with higher levels of management intensity are typically able to support a higher total species richness. As you could see, the average going from somewhere in the mid 100s to in the mid 400s based on management intensity. And the clearest reason for that, the management intervention that I saw most clearly impacting this was managing competition through weeding, which with less competition, weaker species are able to persist. So parks with low management intensity don't manage competition, and a lot of weak species are easily outcompeted, whereas parks with higher management intensities ensure that stronger species don't overtake the weaker species and more are able to survive. But this also shouldn't be noted as a goal or a recommendation. Species richness is an immense benefit and an asset for the parks which strive to have high species richness, but that shouldn't be the metric by which all parks are judged. Management decisions for all 10 parks reviewed for this study were rationalized in detail, even if the decision was to make almost no interventions and allow the site to mostly develop spontaneously. So they can't be judged as successful or unsuccessful, right or wrong, based on the total species they support. They're all thought out and purposeful. And a couple conclusions specifically for the managers of Heemparks and any stakeholders involved. And that goes to say all Heemparks, regardless of intensity, size, location, pretty much any other factor, have ecological, cultural, educational, and social importance. That's the reason that they were founded in the first place, and they maintain these values to this day. One of my favorite quotes that I found in one of the documents was a 25th anniversary publication from Heempark Leiden, which quite bluntly it explains, the translation essentially says the value of Heemparks, 4 pages to answer a stupid question. And they're saying quite directly, there's no way to measure it. They're all valuable, and they specifically focus on species richness and say, yeah, it's great if you have 600 species growing in your park, but that's not the only benefit. There's a lot more at play, and even 100 species, 200 species is still extremely valuable. And this is where I just talk about how incredible the gardeners in all these parks are. The greatest asset to Heemparks is the dedicated individuals who care for them. Everybody that I met and interacted with were incredibly interesting and dedicated people who are so helpful to me. And really, their Heemparks are embodiments of their managers, and the managers are reflections of their park. You can feel talking to them how much they care for their parks, and that's completely unlinked to management intensity. But we need to detail some difficult realities for the future, and that all parks to varying degrees are at risk of reductions in funding and workforce. Several parks recently have lost funding. A lot are seeing risk at retirements of their workforce, who's going to take over when people retire. And generally the amount of work is increasing. So if you have fewer people and more work, all these parks could very well be at risk in the future. And one way to help combat that is to regularly review and adjust management techniques, which most of the parks in this study do, and have seen great benefit from it. The Robert attempted to double their frequency of mowing, and it turned out to visually increase species diversity. While on the other hand, DeMatton tried mowing twice annually, but found that decreased their species richness. So they switched back to once annually. So parks need to be constantly trying new things, adjusting based on the current conditions rather than keeping everything the same, because conditions change and management should change to reflect that. I think that Heemparks should connect more. It seems like a lot are aware of the work each other do, but it would benefit them to connect and share management strategies. But they shouldn't be expected to adjust unless they decide that it's for their benefit. And a bold claim that I want to make, they can't, the managers of these parks can't change everything by themselves. And I think that most, if not all, theme parks should be designated as Rijksmonumenten, which are national monuments. This won't increase funding, this won't increase workforce, but it will give them protection and notoriety that I think they deserve. The status of Rijksmonument may be bestowed on places and objects that have significant cultural and historic value. There's a category for parks and green spaces. Heemparks fit this perfectly. They are saving and showing landscapes and plants that in some cases just don't exist in the wild anymore. They deserve to be protected. Park, De Brock, and Thesis are already monuments. I think that every single one deserves to have a similar status. If they gain this status, they're more likely to receive the recognition and protections that they deserve as unique and valuable parts of the Netherlands' ecological history and culture. And then quickly to wrap up, some broader conclusions for landscape architects, allied professionals, the field in general. Heemparks should be utilized as precedents. These are, as I said, understudied, under-recognized parks. Very few people are aware of their existence. And yet they put many of the core goals of naturalistic design into practice. And they have decades of history to prove their long-term viability. We should be utilizing these as precedents in order to better design naturalistic landscapes in the future, especially considering naturalistic design is becoming more important as wild spaces continue to be lost and disrupted. These successful examples are extremely valuable. And then landscape management should be integrated into the design process. Too frequently, landscape architects disappear at the end of a project. Once it goes in the ground, they move on to designing the next space and don't worry too much about how their park is managed. And from doing an entire multi-year study on landscape management, that's not sustainable. If a high level of species richness is desired, designers and stakeholders must be prepared to put adequate time and resources into ensuring that the landscape is properly cared for. As seen in the Heemparks in this study that utilize low levels of management intensity, it's still possible to sustain beautiful, successful, and species-rich landscapes without spending significant money and time, but managed interventions in these spaces are still purposeful. Low-intensity management is not the same as lack of management. Heempark management managers made deliberate decisions curated towards specific goals in all levels of managed parks. And applying this way of thinking to other naturalistic landscapes will help them sustain desired level of species richness for a substantial length of time. So landscape management is as valuable as the design process. The decision to implement a management plan or forgo it may be the difference between an intricate design becoming overwhelmed with weeds in a few years versus the landscape remaining beautiful and species rich for many decades, as so many theme parks have successfully achieved. With that, I'd like to say thank you to everybody who came out, and I'd love to answer some questions in the time we have left.